picture yourself standing in the center of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The air is thick with the scent of incense and stone dust as crowds fill the great forum, chattering and bustling beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun. Suddenly, the noise begins to fade. Heads turn. A hush falls over the crowd like a wave pulling back from the shore. All eyes are drawn to one striking figure, Emperor Nero, robed in deep purple, walking proudly through the heart of the empire he rules without question. But no one is staring at him. Every gaze is locked on the figure at his side, a person of astonishing beauty, dressed in flowing silk that seems to move like water, shimmering with jewels that sparkle in the light as if lit from within. Her presence is magnetic, almost divine. She walks with the elegance of an empress, face calm and composed, radiating grace and quiet power. But there's something unspoken in the silence. Something eerie. Whispers pass through the onlookers like smoke. Because everyone knows what lies beneath the surface of this dazzling image. The figure beside Nero is not a woman at all, but a boy, Sporus, who has been forced to become someone he never chose to be. The truth is like a blade hiding beneath a silk glove. This boy, once innocent, has been mutilated, manipulated, and transformed into a replica of Nero's deceased wife. Not out of love, but out of madness. Out of a desire so obsessive and twisted that it ignored the boundaries of life, death, and human will. You aren't just witnessing a moment of Roman extravagance. You're witnessing a moment of human tragedy wearing the costume of royalty. It's a performance written by power, directed by grief, and stained by cruelty so deep it defies comprehension. This is no ordinary procession. It is a living monument to one man's delusion and one boy's stolen identity. Before we dive deeper into this unsettling journey of survival and torment, take a moment to consider why stories like this still matter. This is not just about ancient Rome, it is about the timeless patterns of human behavior that continue to shape our world today. It is about what happens when one person holds so much power that they begin to bend reality to suit their desires, even if it means destroying another human being in the process. If you are someone who finds meaning in peeling back the layers of history to uncover the dark truths hidden beneath the surface, if you are drawn to understanding the human soul under the weight of control, grief, and identity loss, then you are exactly where you need to be. Smash that subscribe and like button. This space is not for surface-level facts, it is for the thinkers, the feelers, the seekers of uncomfortable truths. It is for those who want to see history not just as a sequence of events, but as a mirror reflecting our deepest psychological patterns and moral dilemmas. So if you are moved by the convergence of philosophy and history, where the past speaks directly to the present and reveals the fractures in human nature, then stay with me. Leave a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from. There is something quietly powerful about strangers, separated by distance and time, coming together to reflect on lives that were once forgotten, voices that were once silenced, and truths that still resonate centuries later. What you are about to witness is not just another tale of Roman luxury or imperial scandal. It is something far darker, something that grips the soul and refuses to let go. This is a raw and brutal revelation of what happens when absolute power is not tempered by conscience, when love is no longer love but a form of control disguised as affection, when grief no longer seeks healing but instead demands a substitute, no matter the cost. This is a story where a human being is not seen as a person, but as a vessel, an illusion, a shadow molded to satisfy a ruler's fractured mind. It is not a tale of passion, but of possession, not of mourning, but of manipulation, not of life, but of forced performance played out on the grand stage of an empire gone mad. The name Sporus might not yet mean anything to you. Perhaps you have never heard it spoken in a classroom or seen it written in textbooks. But once you step into his story, once you understand what was done to him and how he was remade into a reflection of someone else's madness, his name will stay with you. It will linger in your mind like a question that refuses to be answered. Because Sporus is not just a figure from Roman history. He is a symbol of what happens when the individual is erased, when identity is rewritten by power, and when silence is forced to wear a mask and pretend it is consent. His story is not one you will hear often, but it is one you will not be able to forget. Let us now step closer to the center of this tragedy and meet the men whose descent would shape the nightmare to come. Nero was not born a monster. In fact, when he ascended to the throne at the young age of 16, many Roman citizens believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new and promising era. He began his reign with acts that seemed generous and enlightened. He reduced the burden of taxes on the common people, he poured wealth into public entertainment, and even took part in theatrical performances himself, bridging the gap between ruler and citizen with a flair that charmed the masses. There was a moment, however brief, when Nero was admired as a different kind of emperor, one who understood art, pleasure, and the value of public goodwill. But power, especially when left unchecked, has a way of changing even the most promising hearts. By the year 65 AD, something inside Nero had withered or broken entirely. It might have been the constant weight of fear, the knowledge that betrayal could come from any corner, even from those who smiled in his presence. It might have been the suffocating loneliness that came from being surrounded by people too afraid to speak the truth, too terrified to challenge his ideas or intentions. Or perhaps, it was the emotional wreckage left by the loss of the one person he seemed to love not just deeply, but desperately. A person whose absence cracked the thin layer of sanity he had left. Whether it was the result of political pressure, the emptiness of absolute authority, or the hollow silence of grief, Nero did not simply fall, he unraveled. And in that unraveling, he became something darker, something unpredictable, something capable of turning love into destruction and affection into control. The woman at the heart of Nero's unraveling was named Poppaea Sabina. She was not merely beautiful, she was captivating, calculated, and dangerously intelligent. Everything about her stood in stark contrast to Octavia, Nero's first wife, whose marriage to him was nothing more than a political arrangement, devoid of passion, warmth, or personal connection. Where Octavia was quiet, composed, and restrained, Poppaea was radiant, expressive, and effortlessly commanding. She possessed not only physical allure but the rare kind of charm that could shape the atmosphere of a room without speaking a word. And Nero, already intoxicated by power, fell under her spell in a way that blurred the lines between love, obsession, and madness. His attachment to her quickly became all-consuming. He could not tolerate the idea of her being admired by other men, even in passing glances. Any perceived attention from another was met with immediate, ruthless anger. He surrounded her with people who owed him everything, making sure that loyalty to Poppaea always came through him. His gifts to her were not just generous, they were excessive to the point of self-destruction. Precious gems from distant empires, silk woven with golden threads, fragrances imported from the farthest reaches of the Roman world. Entire segments of the imperial treasury were emptied to please her, as if love could be secured through sheer material overflow. But even this overwhelming display of devotion could not satisfy his hunger to possess her entirely. Nero cast Octavia aside, initiating a scandalous and politically risky divorce that alienated powerful factions within Rome. Then he married Poppaea in a ceremony so lavish, so meticulously constructed, that it appeared less like a union of two people and more like a public performance of dominance and worship. Still, that was not enough. He isolated her, not only from those who might influence her thoughts, but from the world itself. He turned her into a figure of obsession, a living monument to his desires. His private quarters became shrines, filled with portraits, sculptures, and painted scenes of her likeness, crafted not for admiration but for control, so that even when she was not present, she would never leave his sight. Nero did not simply love Poppaea. He needed her in a way that was no longer human. She became less a person and more an idea, something sacred and unreachable, something he wanted to possess completely. He watched her constantly, not out of affection, but out of a desperate need to anchor his crumbling world to a single, unchanging image. Poppaea was not his partner, she was his mirror, reflecting back to him a fantasy of beauty, loyalty, and perfection that he could not find anywhere else, not even within himself. Their relationship was anything but stable. It was a storm constantly gathering strength, made up of unchecked emotion, fragile egos, and dangerous power dynamics. Poppaea, far from being a passive consort, was a woman of fierce intellect and unshakable independence. She was not afraid to voice her thoughts, even when those thoughts directly contradicted the emperor's will. Unlike the many flatterers and sycophants who surrounded Nero and tiptoed around his moods, Poppaea dared to confront him. Her mind was sharp, her opinions strong, and her courage unfiltered. She had learned how to wield influence in a court full of treachery, but she never surrendered her voice in exchange for safety. Then came the night that would change everything. It was the year 65 AD, and the details of the moment remain scattered across the pages of ancient sources. Some say Nero had just returned from his beloved chariot races, others suggest he was still wearing makeup from one of his performances. Regardless of the backdrop, what we do know is that an argument erupted, one that pushed their already volatile dynamic past its breaking point. Poppaea, pregnant at the time, confronted Nero. She questioned his priorities, challenging him on his obsession with public adoration, his neglect of leadership, and perhaps even his worth as a father. In that moment, Nero did not see his wife or his unborn child. He saw defiance, he heard resistance, and something inside him snapped. What happened next was pure devastation. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Nero struck her. Some sources claim it was a single, brutal blow to the abdomen. Others describe it as a sustained assault filled with venom and blind fury. But the outcome did not change. Poppaea, still carrying his unborn heir, collapsed in agony. Her life began to slip away, not from illness or accident, but from the violence of the men who claimed to love her more than anything in the world. Only as she lay there, bleeding and breathless, did the fog of Nero's anger begin to clear. And what he saw in that moment was not an empress or a rival. He saw the ruin of his own soul reflected back at him in her dying eyes. From that point on, Nero fell into a madness so consuming that it altered the fabric of his rule. He refused to cremate Poppaea's body, breaking Roman tradition and the expectations of his people. Instead, he had her embalmed like a sacred relic and entombed with a level of grandeur reserved for the gods. He declared her divine, forming an entire cult in her honor, forcing the court to participate in a fiction where death did not exist and love had not been drowned in blood. He spoke to her corpse daily, whispering confessions, commands, and desperate apologies, as if his voice alone could bring her back. What began as grief quickly decayed into delusion. In this dark theater of mourning, Nero demanded that everyone around him treat Poppaea as though she were still alive. Her name was spoken in the present tense, her place set at feasts, her scent recreated with imported perfumes so her ghost could linger in the halls of the palace. What he had destroyed with his own hands, he now tried to resurrect through ritual, fantasy, and denial. But no amount of worship could cleanse what he had done. No illusion could mask the reality that the empress he claimed to adore had died not from fate or illness, but by the very violence of his own love turned monstrous. In the shadow of Poppaea's death, the imperial court became a place of unbearable tension, a palace where reality had been replaced by illusion and fear. Every member of Nero's inner circle was forced into a delicate performance, one that demanded constant precision and unwavering obedience. No one was allowed to speak of loss. Poppaea was to be referred to as though she still lived and breathed within those marble walls. Her seat remained untouched at grand banquets. Her favorite flowers were arranged daily in the palace gardens, and her voice was spoken of in the present tense, as though it might echo from behind the columns at any moment. This was not grief, it was theater, and one misstep in this carefully staged illusion could cost you your freedom or your life. The court was not simply mourning, it was suffocating under the weight of a delusion that had been forced into reality by imperial command. The emperor's grief had curdled into madness, and everyone was trapped within the fantasy he had built from the ashes of his guilt. Servants, advisors, generals, and artists alike were expected to contribute to the lie, to help sustain the ghost Nero had wrapped around himself like armor. Dissent, even in the form of silence or an unguarded expression, was seen as betrayal. Some who questioned the ritualized charade were sent into exile, others disappeared. Without a trace, it was a kingdom ruled not by law, but by emotional instability, a place where one man's pain dictated the fate of millions, and it was into this fragile and surreal environment that a boy named Sporus entered, unaware that he was stepping into the center of a psychological storm. He was young, perhaps no older than 14 or 15, born into servitude, yet freed and raised within the palace itself. His early life had been shaped by discipline, education, and proximity to power, and his future seemed destined for administrative duty or court service. As a freed youth in the imperial household, he held a position of rare privilege, but with that privilege came absolute dependence. Everything he had, his protection, his role, his very survival, hinged entirely on the emperor's unpredictable favor. Yet it was not Sporus's intelligence or accomplishments that would seal his fate. It was his face. Those who knew Poppaea whispered that the boy's features carried an eerie likeness to the lost empress. His delicate bone structure, the curve of his lips, the subtle shape of his eyes, all bore an uncanny resemblance to the woman Nero could not release from his grip. Even in death, in a world where physical beauty was often treated as destiny, and resemblance could be interpreted as divine design, this similarity would not be overlooked. It was not a compliment, it was a silent curse. That likeness, once noticed, would turn Sporus's life from quiet privilege to inescapable tragedy, because in Nero's haunted mind, the line between memory and reality had already begun to collapse, and the boy who simply looked too much like the woman he had killed would soon be forced to become her, against his will, against his nature, and against everything that once made him who he truly was. When Nero looked upon Sporus, he did not see a boy, he saw a ghost. In Sporus's eyes, he saw a mirror reflecting the past he refused to let go. To the emperor, this resemblance was not coincidence, it was resurrection, and in his grief-stricken, power-drunk mind, the question was no longer whether he could bring Poppaea back, but how. The fact that Sporus was male was not a barrier to Nero, it was merely a detail to be erased, so he commanded the impossible. He ordered his physicians, men trained in the crude and brutal art of Roman medicine, to change Sporus's body, to reshape him into a living echo of the woman Nero had destroyed. The surgery was not medical care, it was violation masquerading as vision. It was a ritual of control carried out with knives. The procedure was primitive, agonizing, and almost certainly performed without consent. In an age with no anesthesia, no advanced sanitation, and no understanding of gender beyond rigid roles, the pain would have been excruciating, the risk of death nearly certain. Sporus was not treated as a patient, but as raw material to be sculpted into an image. The question lingers like smoke. Was it grief that drove Nero to this act, or something darker, a twisted desire to see his power made flesh, to dominate not just the living but the shape of memory itself? Did Sporus's agony fuel some deranged satisfaction in Nero, a grotesque confirmation that even suffering could be controlled? When Sporus finally recovered, physically if not psychologically, he was no longer seen as himself. Nero introduced him not as a servant, not even as a companion, but as Sabina, the name of the empress he had lost. The renaming was not symbolic, it was an erasure. From that moment forward, Sporus's identity was no longer his own. He was given silken gowns tailored to fit the body that had been forcibly reshaped, jewels that had once adorned Poppaea's neck and wrists, makeup to soften his features and erase all trace of the boy he had once been. Stylists trained him in the customs of Roman femininity, how to move, how to sit, how to smile without speaking too boldly. Voice tutors drilled him day after day, forcing his tone higher, his manner gentler, as though changing his voice could complete the illusion that his soul had changed too. But this was not transformation, this was captivity in its most intimate and psychological form. Sporus was placed in chambers filled with Poppaea's scent and likeness, surrounded by reminders of a woman he never knew yet was now expected to become. He was no longer just living in the palace, he was living inside someone else's past. Every movement, every glance, every word had to match Nero's memory of Poppaea. At state functions, Sporus stood not as a consort but as a living statue, repeating Gestures and phrases from conversations he had never been part of, performing scenes from a life he had never lived. The illusion was not his to control, it was Nero's, and Sporus was the canvas, forced to repaint it day after day. He existed inside a theater with no audience, no exit, and no script, only cues whispered by a grieving tyrant desperate to believe the lie he had built. Sporus's body was no longer his name no longer his, and even his past was slipping away, replaced by a fantasy so elaborate that it left no space for who he had once been. The tragedy was not only that he was imprisoned, but that the prison was made of silk and gold, and decorated with memories that did not belong to him. Now imagine waking each morning in a palace of silence, knowing that with every breath, every gesture, every word, you must continue a performance that was never yours to begin with. You are not allowed to be yourself. You are expected to animate a memory, to breathe life into a fantasy crafted from another's grief and madness. That was Sporus's daily reality. He did not just wear Poppaea's clothing, he wore her absence. He lived as the living embodiment of a woman who never truly returned. For years, he stood beside Nero not as a person but as a reconstruction of an idea, paraded before the Roman elite and commoners alike as the emperor's cherished empress. The illusion was so complete that to question it was to invite exile, or worse, but the nightmare only deepened when Nero, consumed by ego and delusion, embarked on a theatrical tour of Greece to showcase his so-called artistic genius. Sporus was made to accompany him, not as a servant, not as a consort, but as a divine relic, the emperor's proof that love could transcend death. Nero presented Sporus to foreign leaders, poets, and priests as if he were a miracle made flesh, dressed in the finest silks, adorned with jewelry once worn by Poppaea, and carefully trained to speak and move as she once had. Sporus was displayed like a masterpiece, not honored for who he was, but for how well he could imitate the dead. In those foreign courts, confusion and horror mingled with forced applause, as dignitaries pretended to believe what they were seeing, all while privately wondering how far into madness Rome's ruler had descended. Back home, however, the empire could no longer bear the weight of Nero's excesses, the spectacle of his grief, the mismanagement of the state, the crushing taxes, the endless indulgences. Resentment spread like wildfire. Roman governors raised their banners in rebellion. The Senate condemned him as an enemy of the Republic, and the Praetorian Guard, once his personal shield, began sharpening their blades against him. The illusion was crumbling, and not even Sporus's tragic performance could hold it together. When Nero fled the city in the year 68 AD, he did not run alone. He took with him what he believed was the last piece of his shattered world, Sporus. The boy who had been surgically transformed, renamed, and trapped within a memory, was now the only companion Nero clung to as everything around him collapsed. Together, they hid in a remote villa outside Rome, while Nero fantasized about escaping east, rebuilding his reign, or dying with theatrical grandeur. He wavered between delusion and despair, alternating between bravado and trembling silence. In his final hours, Nero still could not let go, even as death approached, even as the empire turned its back on him. He demanded that Sporus die with him. He did not ask out of love, but out of obsession, a last desperate attempt to control the illusion until his final breath. The boy who had been remade in someone else's image was expected to be part of Nero's final act, a tragic closing scene in a drama that had consumed both their lives. But in that moment, Sporus was more than a victim. He was a silent witness to the collapse of a god complex, a breathing symbol of how far a man can fall when he believes he can shape reality with force alone. But once Nero was gone, Sporus became an object again, passed from hand to hand like inherited property. Each new man who claimed him forced him back into the same cruel masquerade, dressing him once more in Poppaea's memory. There was no rest, only repetition. Under Vitellius, it reached its final horror. Sporus was prepared for a public spectacle in the Colosseum, meant to degrade him before a roaring crowd, stripping away even the last fragments of dignity. Faced with a fate worse than death, he made the only decision that was truly his. In the year 69 AD, likely still a teenager, he took poison. In that quiet defiance, he reclaimed the one thing that had always been denied to him, his autonomy. Sporus's life may have been buried beneath the weight of empire, spectacle, and silence, but his death was not Nero's script, it was his own. And in that resistance, in that refusal to be used one moment longer, he became something greater than a symbol. He became a reminder that within every story of emperors and marble triumphs lies a human soul, often broken, often silenced. We will never know who Sporus might have become if he had been allowed to be himself, but by speaking his name, by remembering his struggle, we honor the courage it took to say no, even to a god. This was not theater, this was a human life, torn apart by power, yet never fully erased.